Hey guys, today we are going to talk about the Jackson administration. We're putting two objectives together, 405 and 406. Basically, it's Jackson's first term and Jackson's second term. Before we get to the events of his administration, though, we need to talk about some general things that have to do with Jackson. Jackson's presidency is kind of complicated. He's one of these presidents or politicians that will say that he believes in one thing, but then acts basically like the opposite. So, for example, with Jackson, he wants to limit federal power, right? As part of like the Democratic Party at that time, they believed in more states' rights and less federal government. But even though Jackson says he wants to have a weak central government, he uses his power as president excessively. Like, many people thought that he abused his power as president. Sometimes this gets him called King Andrew. We'll look at that picture over there on the right in just a second. But if you were to ask Jackson, like, hey, why are you vetoing these bills? Or why are you ignoring the Supreme Court, which we'll talk about later, he would say it's for the benefit of the common person. So Jackson has his own reasoning for those things, but when you look back on him in history, you can kind of see that he's saying one thing but acting totally differently. He also had a lot of personal grudges with people like Henry Clay or John C. Calhoun, people like that we'll talk about today, where he would use his presidential power to kind of get back at them if he wanted to. And then again, this nickname, Andy Veto or King Andrew, he used the power of the veto, which is totally constitutional. Like, the president has that ability, but he used the power of the veto to cancel laws more than any of the other 6 presidents before him. In the grand scheme of things, looking back at all the presidents we've had, he doesn't use the veto near as much as other presidents, but up until that point, he used his power more than the other presidents did. And he often is butting heads with Congress, so he's using the power of the veto to kind of get Congress to do what he wants. If you look over here in the image, you can see that, he's dressed as a king. This is definitely a critical image of Jackson. He's standing on ripped up versions of the Constitution. Also, we're going to see later in these notes that he vetoes an extension of the National Bank, so he destroys the U.S. Bank that was initially set up by Hamilton, so he's standing on the tatters of that. In his hand, I know it's hard to see, but it says veto in his hand right there, what he's holding. And so by acting in these ways, where he's vetoing bills and possibly doing unconstitutional things, otherwise, some people got kind of a negative impression of him as King Andrew. Some of the things that he did that some people didn't agree with at the time are called the spoils system. He set up this system. It's also known as patronage. It's basically when a president will hire people based on their loyalty to the president or to the political party, instead of having actual qualifications for working. So an example of this is when Jackson became president, he fired all of John Quincy Adams' staff, and he hired his own party supporters. Those are known as patrons, why it's called patronage. This kind of sets up a system for an inefficient government. If you have people that are in the government who don't know what they're doing, the government is just more prone to working inefficiently, as well as to having more corrupt people in government jobs. They don't really care about their job, they just care about having power for themselves. And so the spoils system that started by Jackson is going to continue on all the way until like the 1880s. So it goes on for like 50 years till eventually it's ended after actually a president gets assassinated because of the spoils system. So we'll look at that later on in a different unit. But he's the guy who starts it. He also creates something known as the kitchen cabinet. So we know that the president has the ability to choose his cabinet members, but they have to be approved by the Senate. And Jackson and the Senate did not get along a lot of the time. And so he didn't really trust his own cabinet members. So he created an unofficial group of advisors that would be separate from his real cabinet. And these are the guys that he actually trusted when it came to making decisions, are, this unofficial cabinet. Now, they're called the kitchen cabinet because the idea here is, look, you can see all these guys kind of in the kitchen. But the idea is that the kitchen cabinet would come in through the back doors of the White House through the kitchen. So they're like a secret group that comes in through the back of the White House. All right, so here's some basic things about Jackson. Let's go look at his first term. So as part of the American system that Henry Clay set up, a big part of that is tariffs, right? Tariffs are going to help to strengthen the northern manufacturing economy, as well as if people bought foreign goods, and that money would go into the government, and then that could pay for things like infrastructure, canals, railroads, those kinds of things. So between 1815 and 1828, tariffs have increased. And what we're starting to see is this is creating sectionalism because the North and the South have very different ideas about tariffs. The North loves tariffs. It encourages the sale of U.S. goods because foreign goods are more expensive. And then it strengthens the Northern economy because that money from the sale of domestic American goods goes into those Northern factories. So every time that tariffs get higher, which basically means foreign goods become more expensive, people are more likely to buy American goods, and the North loves it. The South, on the other hand, hates tariffs. It's a little bit more complicated than the Northern point of view. So let's actually go through these steps down here, and then we'll break it down a little bit more. So foreign goods are more expensive because of tariffs. Americans buy more U.S. goods, sure. But if we are buying more U.S. goods, then we are not buying European goods. European countries get angry and they retaliate by not buying Southern cotton. So what you see here is that the cotton sales for the South are hurt when tariffs go up because other countries aren't buying our cotton. Further, Southern states still have to buy Northern goods because they are slightly cheaper than foreign goods, but they're still pretty expensive. So the economies of the Southern states suffer while the North gets richer. So if you want to sum this all up, basically all goods are now more expensive. U.S. goods are just slightly like a penny cheaper than foreign goods. And also you have a decreased sale of cotton abroad. So the South is pretty pissed off because of that. Okay, so here's kind of setting the scene for this big crisis that is going to happen over tariffs in Jackson's first term. So it's called the South Carolina Nullification Crisis. Basically, it's a national crisis over rising tariffs and the threat of nullification. There's a really good cartoon here that kind of shows how the North and the South feel about tariffs. We have the tariffs that are on the back of the South. It's making them skinny and poor, while the North is getting fat and happy. They're held together by the Union. What we're going to see with this nullification crisis is that this relationship is going to get strained. So there's a tariff in 1828 called, or nicknamed, the Tariff of Abominations by John C. Calhoun. He is the Vice President of the United States at this point. He's from the South, and he hates this tariff. So Calhoun writes this essay. It's called the South Carolina Exposition, where he basically argues that the Southern states should nullify the tariff and possibly even secede from the country, like leave the country. Remember, nullify means to ignore a law because it's unconstitutional. All right. So Jackson definitely doesn't agree with this. He believes that he should have the power to send troops to South Carolina to enforce the tariff and get people to actually pay it, right? That's his job. That's what Washington did when the Whiskey Rebellion happened. And so Jackson's like, well, there's a rebellion essentially happening here. I should be able to send troops. So at this point, we're kind of at the brink of a civil war, right? We've got the president threatening to send troops, and we've got another state threatening to secede. Like it's a pretty big issue. So we need some type of resolution to bring us down from the Civil War. So the resolution is that Henry Clay, right, Captain America here, the guy who's always coming up with compromises, Henry Clay gets Congress to pass the Tariff of 1832. Essentially, it just lowers tariffs gradually over the next few years. Now, that pleases the South. Well, Jackson feels like he wants something from this deal. And so Congress agrees to pass the Force Bill. The force bill gave the president power to use the military against states that start to claim nullification. And we actually don't have the force bill today. It was just a short-lived bill just to deal with this crisis. But it opened up the door for Jackson to officially handle nullification with troops. That doesn't happen though. He doesn't send troops. The South doesn't secede. They don't even really get to nullify the tariff. They still have to follow it now. But we can see that we were at the brink of civil war, but we were backed down by a compromise. All right, so Calhoun was largely behind the South Carolina nullification crisis. He was the one urging South Carolina not to follow the laws. And so he resigns as vice president in 1832 when Jackson runs for re-election for his second term. Okay, so that's kind of like the big deal with Jackson's first term is the South Carolina nullification crisis. The big deal in his second term is known as the Bank War. Okay, so here's the background here. Jackson hates Henry Clay. A lot of it goes back to the corrupt bargain when Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams made that deal for John Quincy Adams to become president if Henry Clay is Secretary of State. But he hates Henry Clay. And so he uses some of his presidential power to get back at Clay. A really good example of this is what's called the Maysville Road veto, where Jackson vetoed a bill that would have given federal funding for a highway in Kentucky, which is Henry Clay's home state. So not only does that like kind of hit Henry Clay in the gut because it's his home state of Kentucky, but it also is part of the American system, these infrastructure or like road building projects. Jackson's like, nope, gonna veto it, don't care, don't like you, don't want the road. Okay, another thing Jackson really doesn't like that's part of the American system is the National Bank. Jackson believes that the bank benefits the rich people, not the common people of the U.S. He has a quote here where he says, the bus stands for Bank of the U.S. The bus is a monster that corrupts our statesmen and wants to destroy our Republican institution. He has another melodramatic quote over here. The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it. Yeah, he's very dramatic. But I do think there's a little bit of truth to this idea of only benefiting the rich. The bank would loan money to rich people with low interest rates, but would either not issue loans to poor people or would issue loans to poorer people with really high interest rates. So it did seem like it did favor the rich people. So I'll give Jackson that. And remember, Jackson's all about the common person, right? So he wants to kill this bank. In 1832, this is the year that Jackson's going to run for re-election, Henry Clay proposes an early recharter of the National Bank, basically saying, hey, the bank has a few more years to live before it expires. Let's go ahead and renew it early so it can have more years of life. He also knew that Jackson would veto the extension of the bank and that would hopefully, in Clay's eyes, make Jackson lose support in the election of 1832. Just as expected, Jackson vetoed the extension of the National Bank, and he was saying that I just don't think it benefits the common people, so I don't want it. And Jackson is often shown as battling the bank as a many-headed monster. All these people represent different people in the National Bank right here. And Jackson is shown kind of slaying the monster. All right, so Jackson vetoes the National Bank re-extension, and the election of 1832 rolls around. And this completely backfires in Henry Clay's face. Henry Clay was thinking that Jackson would lose support from the American people by vetoing the bank, but it's the opposite. Jackson gains support. I mean, look at all of those states that Jackson wins. He doesn't get Kentucky. Clay gets Kentucky because that's where Clay's from. But for the most part, I mean, Andrew Jackson is just like taking the stage. And he also doesn't get South Carolina because they don't like Jackson because of the whole nullification crisis. So Jackson's re-elected. He chooses a new vice president. This guy's name is Martin Van Buren. So let's look at some of the consequences of the bank war. In 1835, Jackson knows the bank still has like another year or so to live, and so he wants to spend the money in it to repay the national debt. He also raises a little bit more money by selling Western land, and he vetoes all spending bills. So for the first and only time in America's history, in 1835, Jackson paid off the entire national debt of the United States. Okay, so then after he pays off all the debt, he takes the remaining money that was in the national bank and he moves it into state banks. And these state banks are known as pet banks because they are loyal to Jackson. Think of like a teacher's pet, right? Well, once the national bank is empty, it doesn't have any money in it anymore, the national bank then becomes bankrupt. And a bank with no money in it dies. So this is the end of the national bank right here. So now all of this federal money is sitting in pet banks. Here's kind of an image of the movement of that money. You've got Jackson in the black coat. He is issuing an order that is calling for all the money to be moved to pet banks. The national bank is crumbling back here. This guy is the head of the national bank. He's drawn as like a devil trying to run around and collect all the loans. And then this guy back here, he was a common image in political cartoons back then. His name was Jack Downing. He basically just represented the common man. And you can see like the common man is literally patting Jackson on the back for killing the bank. All right, so our last slide and then we're done. So the pet banks start to print way too much money because they're not communicating with each other. So they just start like sending out dollar bills. And this is a problem because when you have too much paper money with no real currency like gold or silver to back it up, this causes something called inflation. It basically just means that prices are going to go up because the value of your money is going down. Like your money doesn't really mean a lot because there's so much of it in circulation. So for example, one day an apple can cost $1, but because the value of that money goes down, the next day an apple is going to cost 2 of those dollars. And a little bit of inflation is normal. You guys probably learned this in civics, right? Like prices go up over time, but if it's like doubling overnight like it was back then, that's a huge problem for the economy. So Andrew Jackson wants to handle it. He issues an executive order. Remember, executive orders do not need congressional approval. It's something the president has the right to do when he or she feels like there's a crisis. And this executive order was called the Specie Circular. Basically what it said is that we are no longer going to use any paper money. We are only going to use gold and silver coins. So let's say that you have a wallet full of paper money and you're like, okay, Jackson just said none of this money counts anymore. You're going to go to the bank and you're going to want to exchange those paper dollars for actual gold and silver coins, which is exactly what people did. They ran to the banks to exchange their money, but the banks ran out of specie. They ran out of gold and silver. And once the banks have no money in it anymore, they're bankrupt. So people lost their savings, businesses go bankrupt because they can't borrow money or pay back their loans. People lose their jobs because businesses go out of business. And all of this becomes known as the Panic of 1837. People who once like really loved Jackson find themselves in really bad economic hardships. Their families are suffering. They've got people at their doors trying to collect money from them. This down here with all the tools on the ground illustrates that he can't find any work anywhere. And so it was a pretty dark time in American history, this economic panic that was all caused by Jackson and his war against the bank. Now, I know those notes are really long today. We smushed 2 objectives together, but hopefully you guys have a good understanding of what happened in his first term with the nullification crisis and in his second term with the bank war.